I was at a friend's barbecue last weekend, and we were all listening to another friend, Mark, tell a story. It's been 3 years since he lost his wife, and you can still hear the affection in his voice whenever he talks about her. He wasn't being sad, just remembering. He was laughing about a ridiculous vacation they'd taken, and then from across the table, a relative of the host, meaning, well, I'm sure, just blurted out, "It's so good to see you laugh, Mark, but don't you think it's time to let go and really move on?" The air just went out of the yard. The sizzling of the grill suddenly felt deafening. Mark didn't get angry. He just gave this small, tired smile and said nothing. But it was the look in his eyes that stuck with me. It wasn't the look of someone who was stuck. It was the look of someone being asked to amputate a part of themselves. That moment made me realize we have it all wrong. We talk about grief as if it's a flu we need to get over, something with an expiration date. We ask, how long does it take to forget? But what if that's the wrong question entirely? What if the brain on a biological level isn't designed to forget? What if it's designed to integrate? That premise, that healing isn't about forgetting, but about integration. That's really the central driving question of this entire deep dive. You know, the conventional Western view of grief, this idea of a linear process with like an expiration date, it fundamentally misunderstands human neurology and psychology. It forces people like Mark into this cruel choice, really, between honesty and social acceptance.
It's such an essential conversation because that societal pressure to move on, it just clashes directly with how emotional memory actually works, how enduring it is. Today, we're really going to dive deep into why these rigid expectations even exist.
Yeah, where do they come from?
Exactly. Yeah. And what does the cutting-edge neuroscience actually tell us about why traumatic memory is so persistent? Crucially, though, how are clinical approaches, and systemic ones too, finally starting to shift toward this idea of integration?
Right.
So our mission today really is to dismantle some of those sociocultural myths, get solid on the neurobiological facts, and showcase some recovery models that truly honor the long-term, individualized support people need after a profound loss.
Okay, let's start by really scrutinizing the culture that produced that incredibly painful question Mark got at the barbecue. Our research on this, it's absolutely scathing. It argues that the pressure felt by the bereaved is nothing short of cultural oppression.
Oppression is a strong word, but it fits. It stems from a really deep-seated discomfort, you know? Western society is often described as, well, emotionally stunted and fundamentally scared of mortality.
We just don't want to look at it.
We don't. We don't want to look at death or prolonged pain because, frankly, it reminds us of our own fragility and this discomfort. It creates this rigid societal mechanism. It's designed to quickly process grief and then discard it. It's often called the grief box.
The grief box. That sounds, yeah, like a coffin for authentic emotion.
It pretty much is. The expectation is that the bereaved person, they enter this compact, time-limited structure.
Like clock's ticking.
Clock is ticking. And they must emerge quickly, fixed and whole.
Yeah.
Is the language used. It's just an unreasonable performance requirement we impose on people who are navigating the most profound kind of human suffering.
And central to this performance is what we're calling the timeline trap. Society sort of tacitly dictates that grief should be resolved, or at least, minimized, within about 12 months. If you're still weeping or genuinely struggling on that first anniversary, maybe you get a pass. But if you're struggling 6 months later, or like Mark, 3 years later, that's when the judgment really starts to creep in.
And the irony is just, it's staggering. Because for so many people who have experienced profound loss, the second year is frequently much harder than the first.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, in that initial year, you're often buffered, right, by the physiological shock, the adrenaline, and just the urgent business of death.
The funeral, the paperwork.
Exactly. The funeral, the immediate wave of visitors, the legal stuff, the financial arrangements. Your time is just consumed. Psychologically, you're basically in crisis mode.
Running on fumes and maybe that initial burst of social support.
Precisely. You're running on pure adrenaline and that initial flood of support. Grief, real grief, sometimes doesn't even truly begin until after that first anniversary passes. Once all those obligatory milestones are done, the first birthday without them, the first holiday, the first tax season.
All those painful firsts.
Right. And it's only then, once the initial shock wears off and the support has kind of drifted away, that the full, mundane, permanent weight of the loss really hits home. And yet, that is exactly when society expects you to be back to normal.
It's so backwards. And this pressure, it feeds directly into the stigmatization of honesty, doesn't it? It just becomes far easier to say, yeah, I'm okay, and fake a smile when someone asks, rather than revealing how you actually feel.
Absolutely, because if you dare to be honest, truly honest, about the depth of your loss years later, you risk being labeled, you're stuck, you need good therapy.
Right, like something's wrong with you.
Exactly. The cultural message is crystal clear. Authentic vulnerability is seen as a kind of pathological failure.
And this leads us right back to that linguistic habit centered around that phrase Mark heard. Move on.
Ugh, that phrase.
I think we all instinctively recoil from it, but why? What's the actual psychological damage it causes? Why is it so harmful?
The sources we look at are very, very clear on this. Move on carries this profoundly negative connotation because it suggests a closure that simply doesn't exist. It demands an amputation.
Effectively, amputation.
It asks the grieving person to erase the memory, erase the impact of the person they lost. It almost suggests that if they truly loved them, they'd somehow replace that connection with something new and just.
Yeah.
Forget the former pain.
It implies a lack of loyalty, doesn't it? Almost like you're betraying the person who's gone if you're not over it.
Precisely. Whereas the psychological reality is there is only moving forward. You are forever changed by the loss you endured. Grief isn't some neat linear series of steps like you see in a textbook diagram.
No, it's messy.
It's incredibly messy. One source described it beautifully, I thought, as an ugly mess of duality.
Duality, meaning?
Meaning it contains moments of deep, just shattering sadness mixed, often unexpectedly, with incredible happiness.
Yeah.
With joy, even. A renewed appreciation for life. You carry both those realities simultaneously. They coexist.
That makes so much sense. And that duality brings us to another really cruel expectation of this grief box. The demand for silence. Society expects the bereaved to just bury the dead forever, making it uncomfortable or even taboo to talk about the lost loved one after that arbitrary deadline has passed.
And this silence is profoundly cruel because it compounds the loss. It adds another layer of pain. Forgetting they existed or just pretending they were never important enough to mention again. That is the truly harmful action.
Right.
The reality for most grieving people is that speaking of the deceased, even decades later, is actually a healthy and peaceful way to move forward. It often fills the griever with joy, not sadness as they recall a shared moment, a funny story.
They want them remembered.
They want their loved one to be remembered. Refusing to say their name, acting like they never existed, that feels like a second death.
This tension, this whole forced resilience thing, it's often most visible in the professional environment, isn't it? Workplaces rarely, if ever, honor the true timeline of grief.
Almost never.
Let's look at a composite case study that really brings this to life. We'll call him David. He's a senior project manager in a pretty fast-paced, competitive field. When he lost his life partner, very suddenly, the company offered him just 5 days of bereavement leave.
5 days, which is barely enough time to attend the funeral, maybe start the initial paperwork maze.
Right.
But certainly not enough time to even begin processing the magnitude of that kind of trauma. It's a systemic reinforcement of that timeline trap we talked about.
Absolutely. So when David returned to work, the unspoken contract was pretty clear. Work was the antidote to sorrow. His colleagues, probably meaning well, expected him to just immediately channel his energy into deadlines, hoping the grief would somehow vanish under the workload.
But the opposite happened, didn't it?
Completely. His grief didn't recede. It actually became a cognitive obstacle. He couldn't focus the same way.
And this is where the biological reality crashes headlong into professional expectations. If you're experiencing profound emotional distress, your executive functions, your attention, your flexible thinking, they are impaired. It's physiological.
So he started missing things.
He probably started missing key details in spreadsheets. Maybe his ability to switch between tasks flexibly was gone. His temper might have been shorter. But because he hadn't achieved that neat linear recovery, society demanded.
He was judged.
He was judged. Colleagues started whispering that he was not getting it together after, 6 months?
Yeah. And his forced resilience, that pressure to maintain the professional composure, to act fixed, it just pushed his authentic grief entirely underground. Instead of processing the loss, he ended up developing prolonged anxiety, isolation, and real professional distress.
Which is so counterproductive.
Totally. Allowing him the authentic space to just be temporarily broken would have actually facilitated integration much faster than forcing him to perform normalcy. This case just proves how deeply these professional expectations hinder authentic long-term healing. They make it harder, not easier.
So we've seen the damage done by this societal expectation to just forget, to move on. Now, let's pivot and really confirm the biological imperative that makes forgetting impossible. The brain, quite simply, is not designed to forget profound loss or trauma. Neurobiologically, it demands integration.
Okay, so if the brain isn't designed to forget, what's the mechanism? What makes these memories so sticky? Why is a traumatic memory so fundamentally different from, say, forgetting where you put your keys?
It really comes down to the nature of what we call hot memories. Traumatic or intensely emotional experiences like the death of a loved one or surviving violence, they create these emotionally charged recollections. These memories aren't stored neutrally like facts up in the cortical regions. They get filed simultaneously in two critical deep brain structures.
Okay, and those are the alarm system and the narrative center you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. They are stored in the amygdala, which is the brain's rapid response alarm system, responsible for fear, threat detection, emotional intensity.
The panic button.
Basically, yes. And also in the hippocampus, which is the narrative center. That's what stamps the memory with context, where it happened, when it happened, the sequence of events. Because they're stored with that amygdala alarm attached, they remain incredibly vivid, visceral, and highly resistant to fading.
So every time the memory gets accessed, even years later, that associated fear or panic response gets reactivated too, making it feel like the event is happening right now.
Precisely. That's a hallmark of unprocessed trauma. This persistence, though, it actually serves an evolutionary purpose. It helped our ancestors avoid future threats. These emotional memory pathways get embedded through a deep process called fear conditioning. When a memory is tied to survival, the brain prioritizes it. It makes it extremely difficult to simply overwrite it or file it away as irrelevant, which is what happens naturally to more mundane everyday memories.
And this isn't just in your head, right? This has measurable physical effects. Grief isn't just a psychological phenomenon. It's a biological state that impacts the whole body.
Oh, absolutely. It's a profound physiological state. Trauma demonstrably alters stress hormones specifically. It tends to elevate cortisol and adrenaline long-term. It also impairs immune function. This leads directly to chronic physical symptoms.
Like what kind of symptoms?
These can include things like persistent muscle tension, unexplainable chronic pain, digestive issues, or even persistent numbness in certain areas of the body. That last one is a manifestation known as somatoform dissociation.
Somatoform dissociation. Can you unpack that a bit more? How does the body literally hold the trauma when the mind maybe tries to push it away or compartmentalize it?
Yeah, it's fascinating and complex. Somatoform dissociation is essentially the physical manifestation of that psychological trauma. The body remains locked in a chronic state, fight or flight, or sometimes freeze long after the actual threat is gone. That perpetual flood of stress hormones keeps muscles constantly tensed. It depletes bodily resources, contributes to chronic inflammation and pain. It's like the body is acting as a physical shield against the emotional overwhelm.
So the body is still screaming danger even when the person consciously maybe feels they've calmed down or moved past it?
Exactly. The physical memory persists. And beyond the body's internal chemistry, the brain itself is visibly altered by significant grief and trauma. We can see changes.
Really? Physically rewired?
That's right. Grief and trauma physically rewire the anterior cingulate cortex, the ACC. This is a crucial brain region. It's responsible for regulating emotion, shifting attention, flexible thinking, impulse control. Basically, our ability to manage ourselves.
So if you feel stuck, like you can't shift your focus, or you're constantly overwhelmed by emotion, that's not a character flaw.
Not at all. It is a biological adaptation. It's a physical change in the ACC's ability to cooperate efficiently with other parts of the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, which handles reasoning and planning.
That distinction feels critical, because when we tell people to just cheer up or get over it, we're essentially asking them to reverse a fundamental physiological change in their brain.
Without providing them with any tools to actually help rewire their own brains, like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off.
Yeah, which is why the goal has to shift, right? Since erasing these deeply embedded hot memories is biologically impossible.
It's impossible. So the focus of recovery, the goal, must fundamentally be integration.
Integration, meaning what exactly?
It means transforming your relationship with the experience. It means reducing the emotional charge of the memory, understanding its impact, and weaving it into the larger narrative of your life. So the pain can be carried, yes, but not as a crushing burden that defines you. More like a scar, something that has changed you, profoundly perhaps, but no longer actively threatens your sense of self or safety.
Okay, so this goal of integration, of carrying the pain without being crushed by it, It often requires clinical pathways that go beyond just traditional talk therapy, especially for people with complex trauma. You mentioned complex PTSD, dissociative disorders. These individuals often lack the emotional capacity initially to endure standard exposure-based therapies.
That's right. They are often too emotionally fragile, or the technical term is dysregulated. Their nervous system is already overwhelmed, forcing them into deep, detailed recounting of the traumatic events too early. It often pushes them into a state of flooding, overwhelming emotion, or dissociation, where they mentally check out.
Which just reinforces the trauma response.
Exactly. It can make things worse and often leads to high dropout rates from therapy. So we need stabilization first. We absolutely must quiet that overactive alarm system before we can even begin to effectively reprocess the traumatic files.
So the first critical step is installing regulative capacity. And this is where some non-invasive neurobiological techniques like neurofeedback therapy or NFT have become really essential in complex trauma treatment. Can you explain what NFT actually is?
Sure. NFT is a type of biofeedback specifically for the brain. It's a therapeutic intervention that uses immediate, real-time feedback, usually from a computer program, to help a patient learn to reorganize and retrain their own brainwave activities.
How does that work practically? Sensors on the head?
Yes, sensors are placed gently on the scalp to measure brain waves, the electrical activity of the brain. This activity is fed into a computer, which then provides feedback to the patient, often through sound or visual signals. For example, a video game character might only move forward, or a pleasant sound might play, only when the patient's brain produces the desired brainwave frequency in a specific area.
So you're learning to control your brain waves. What specific waves are you targeting to calm that fear-driven midbrain you talked about?
Primarily, we're working on regulating the balance, the ratio, between slower brain waves like theta waves, which are associated with drowsiness or deep internal focus, and faster waves, like high beta waves, which correlate with anxiety, rumination, and hyperarousal.
Okay.
We often train the brain to enhance alpha activity, which is linked to calm alertness, and sometimes alpha theta activity for deep relaxation and accessing subconscious processes. The goal is to dampen that excessive, frantic, high beta activity. And doing this actually changes the brain's functional connectivity.
Meaning it helps different brain parts work together better, like that ACC.
Precisely. NFT has been shown to enhance the anterior cingulate cortex's, ACC, ability to cooperate effectively with the prefrontal cortex. This is critical for complex patients because it directly improves self-regulation, flexible thinking, impulse control, and focus. Essentially, NFT helps calm that fear-driven midbrain and significantly heightens the brain's overall integrative capacity. It prepares the ground, making it safer and more possible to do deeper trauma work later.
Right, so once that stabilization is achieved, once the system is calm enough to actually process information without freaking out, then we can move to the reprocessing phase. And a major player here is EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing.
Yes, EMDR is a highly structured psychotherapy. It involves the patient recalling distressing images or memories while simultaneously experiencing bilateral sensory input.
Bilateral meaning side to side.
Exactly. Typically, it involves alternating side-to-side eye movements following the therapist's fingers, but it can also use alternating tactile stimulation, like hand buzzers or auditory tones delivered through headphones.
Why is EMDR so effective for PTSD, anxiety, depression? How does it target the way the memory is stored?
Okay, so the prevailing theory is the Adaptive Information Processing Model, or AIP. The AIP model suggests that those traumatic memories we talked about, the hot ones, are essentially frozen in time. They're stuck in their own isolated neural network, lacking the necessary connections to more adaptive, contextual information, like the fact that the danger is over.
They're stuck in their raw emotional state.
Exactly. Now, the bilateral stimulation, the eye movements or taps, acts as a dual attention task. The patient has to hold the distressing image or thought in mind while also performing this cognitively taxing task of tracking the movement or noticing the taps.
So it's taxing the working memory, like juggling two things at once mentally.
Yes. That taxing of working memory seems to be crucial. It appears to pull processing resources away from the intensity of the memory itself, creating a temporary state of instability for that frozen memory network. This allows for what neuroscientists call memory reconsolidation.
Reconsolidation, meaning it gets refiled.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
During this reconsolidation window, the memory can be integrated with existing adaptive information. Crucially, the knowledge that the event is over, that the patient survived, that they are safe now. It helps move the memory file from the brain's current threat category to a resolved story from the past category. The memory doesn't disappear, but its emotional charge is significantly reduced.
And as you mentioned, this isn't just theoretical guesswork. Studies actually show distinct neurobiological changes, different patterns of brain activation after successful EMDR, right? Demonstrating that reduced emotional charge.
Correct. There's fMRI evidence showing changes in amygdala activation, for instance. Furthermore, successful treatment with therapies like EMDR has even been linked to structural brain changes over time, including measurable growth in gray matter volume in certain areas. This really underscores the profound physical impact of successful psychological integration.
Okay, before we dive into a case study that pulls this together, we have to acknowledge that trauma lives in the body too. If we only focus on the cognitive and emotional pieces, we miss those chronic physical symptoms, the muscle tension, the pain that we discussed earlier. This is where somatic therapy becomes such a valuable complement to things like EMDR and NFT.
Absolutely critical. Somatic therapy operates on the core principle that the trauma energy, the activation from fight or flight or freeze, gets stored, trapped in the body's nervous system. It manifests physically in muscle tension, shallow breathing, posture, chronic pain patterns. Somatic work aims to help the person safely release this stored energy.
How does it do that?
Often through mindful attention to physical sensations. There's a useful framework called CBAM that stands for sensation, imagery, behavior, effect, and meaning.
CBAM. Can you walk us through a quick example? How would a therapist use that to help someone release physical trauma?
Sure. Let's say a patient reports chronic tightness, a knot in their shoulder that flares up when they feel stressed. The therapist might guide them to gently focus on the sensation, its location, texture, temperature, then explore any imagery associated with it. Maybe it feels like a tight, cold metal ball. Notice any related behavior. Perhaps they hold their breath or clench their jaw when they focus on it. Identify the affect, the emotion connected to it. Maybe it's fear or anger. Finally, by helping the patient explore and articulate the marriage, meaning maybe realizing that this knot is the physical residue of bracing for impact during an accident, or the feeling of helplessness during an assault, they begin to make conscious the unconscious holding pattern. Through various techniques like mindful movement, breath work, or gentle touch, they can then begin to regulate that nervous system activation and release the stored energy. It allows for physical integration alongside the cognitive reprocessing from something like EMDR.
That makes sense. It's treating the whole person. Which brings us to Sonia. This is a really powerful case vignette that demonstrates the necessity of this phased, flexible, and combined approach you've been outlining. Sonia presented with complex PTSD, an unspecified dissociative disorder, and chronic pain, all significantly exacerbated by the traumatic murder of her brother. Her initial PCL-5 score, which is a standard measure for PTSD symptoms, was extremely high, 71.
Right, so given her high level of dissociation, her emotional fragility, forcing her straight into traditional exposure therapy would likely have been harmful, contraindicated. She absolutely needed stabilization first to prevent further fragmentation or re-traumatization.
So phase 1 was stabilization using neurofeedback. Sonia underwent 10 sessions of NFT first. What were the initial results of just that phase?
The results of just the NFT were crucial and quite significant. Her PCL-5 score dropped dramatically, from that 71 down to 31, which is actually considered below the clinical threshold for PTSD diagnosis in many cases, and this is before any direct trauma reprocessing began.
Wow, just from calming the brainwaves.
Essentially, yes. She gained significant regulative capacity. She reported sleeping better, her decision-making improved, and she described achieving a state of calm where, in her words, she could finally think without getting disordered.
That state of calm, that foundation, presumably allowed her to then engage with the memory in a more meaningful way. But it sounds like she needed more than just reprocessing. She needed a sense of closure.
Correct. So in phase 2, she engaged in a single, very targeted EMDR session. But crucially, this wasn't just standard EMDR. It was carefully framed within a resource-oriented psychodynamic therapy approach, and it was combined specifically with an ego state intervention.
Ego state, what's that?
Ego state therapy views the personality as composed of different parts or ego states, each with its own feelings and functions. In Sonia's case, the intervention helped her connect different parts of herself, perhaps the part that was overwhelmed at the hospital, the part carrying the grief, and her present-day adult self to facilitate a kind of internal dialogue and a final farewell to her murdered brother. The focus was as much on integration and emotional completion as it was on reducing the fear memory's charge.
So it was tailored, multifaceted, and the results of that combined flexible treatment.
The results were quite remarkable. Within just 4 months of beginning this phased treatment, starting with NFT, then the carefully framed EMDR session, Sinus PCL-5 score dropped further to 7.
7 from 71.
Yes, 7. Decisively in the non-clinical range. More importantly, she reported gaining a deepened sense of joy and felt able to finally pursue her studies and engage in intimate relationships again, all while carrying the memory of her brother with a sense of peace, not constant distress.
That's incredible.
It really is. This case is just a stunning example that for complex patients, flexibility, combining different modalities, and prioritizing regulation before exposure can lead to powerful, complete healing. It really defies rigid adherence to standardized therapy manuals and highlights the need for customized care.
Okay, so moving from that really hopeful individual clinical journey to the systemic level, we see that these same principles, the nonlinear nature of healing, the need for integration, the limits of standardization, they apply just as acutely when communities are recovering from collective trauma. Things like natural disasters, mass violence incidents, acts of terrorism.
Absolutely. The core challenge for policymakers, for organizations setting up support frameworks, is acknowledging that recovery is fundamentally individualized and long-term, even when the traumatic incident affects thousands of people simultaneously. In the immediate aftermath of a large-scale disaster, intense stress reactions are normal. They are adaptive responses to an abnormal situation, not necessarily pathological signs.
And in that immediate phase, there's one really crucial instruction that's come out of years of research, right? It's about actively avoiding harm.
Yes, this is critical. Avoid psychological debriefing within the first 48 hours or so. Decades of studies have consistently shown that forcing people into a structured psychological debriefing session immediately following a traumatic event is, at best, not helpful and may actually cause more harm than good.
Why is that? It sounds counterintuitive.
It seems to interfere with the brain's natural recovery processes. It can overwhelm coping mechanisms that are just starting to come online, potentially reinforcing the traumatic memory rather than helping process it. The evidence against immediate mandatory debriefing is very strong.
So instead of forcing people to immediately relive the trauma in detail, what is the priority in those first hours and days?
The absolute priority should be establishing safety, promoting calm, and providing practical support. Maslow's hierarchy, right? We need food, shelter, reliable communication, basic security, and strengthening social support networks, helping people connect with loved ones, with their immediate community that is consistently proven to be the single biggest protective factor against long-term psychological distress. We have to meet those fundamental practical needs before attempting complex psychological interventions.
Okay, so once that immediate crisis phase passes, we move into what you called the long tail of recovery, which, as we've established throughout this conversation, lasts far, far beyond the 6-month or 1-year mark that the media typically focuses on.
The long tail is immense and often underestimated. Rates of mental illness, PTSD, depression, complicated grief, they affect a significant minority of survivors. And these issues can persist for years, sometimes even decades. There are long-term studies, for example, conducted 20 years after the Ash Wednesday bushfires in Australia that still detected significant mental health impacts in the children of affected families.
20 years later.
20 years. Furthermore, we know from events like Hurricane Katrina or the Black Saturday bushfires, also in Australia, that the rates of mental illness often continue to climb for at least the first 12 months after a major incident, as the long-term consequences and the loss of support systems really set in.
So the implication for policy is clear. Systemic support and funding have to be long-term. They need to last years, not just be reactive in the immediate crisis phase. What are some effective intermediate phase strategies? Things that genuinely facilitate community integration and resilience after that initial period.
Effective intermediate strategies often involve establishing proactive outreach programs. Think about the systems set up after the London bombings, for example. They actively reached out to screen and offer treatment to those who were most at risk, but might not seek help on their own.
Finding the people who fall through the cracks.
Exactly. And implementing interventions focused on building practical skills. Things like problem-solving skills, coping strategies, resilience training. These approaches are endorsed by organizations like the World Health Organization. They often focus less on repeatedly reliving the trauma and more on equipping individuals with tangible tools to manage the ongoing post-disaster stressors, which increases their sense of agency and control.
But even with the best intentions, standardized public health policies, which are necessary for managing things on a mass scale, can really struggle to accommodate the unique neurological and psychological imprints of individual trauma, even within the same collective event, right?
They absolutely can. We see this disparity clearly when we contrast the experiences of different individuals within the same tragedy. Consider a composite example based on experiences from 9/11 survivors. You might have the firefighter who experienced direct loss, high exposure, was maybe injured.
Right.
He was immediately integrated into a massive, structured, community-based support system. His firehouse, his union, his colleagues, probably his neighborhood rallied around him. His grief, his trauma was validated institutionally. That structure aided his integration process.
Okay, but then contrast that with, say, the accountant, someone who worked in the towers, escaped physically unharmed, but obviously sustained a profound psychological wound. Maybe they moved away a year later for a new job.
Exactly. That person lacked the official victim status in the same way, didn't have that localized, built-in community network sharing the same direct experience. They might suffer debilitating anxiety, profound, disconnected grief years later, feeling isolated in their experience.
Because the system wasn't set up for their kind of wound.
Precisely. The system provided a clear structure for the visible, official wound the firefighter directly impacted. But it often had no adequate mechanism to validate, find, or resource the less visible, purely psychological wound of the accountant who moved away. This highlights the fundamental flaw of trying to apply a purely standardized approach. The diverse neurological and psychological needs of survivors simply defy standardized recovery timelines and definitions.
And this failure to properly define and support the less visible wound seems to lead directly into some really deep systemic inequities, particularly when we look at research and response around mass violence and terrorism, or MVT.
Oh, absolutely. There are critical evidence gaps in MVT research that really constrain effective policymaking, and one of the biggest issues is the definition problem itself. Problem number one. Many official data sources, funding streams, they only define MVT victims as those who were physically injured or killed at the scene.
So that automatically excludes.
It often excludes huge numbers of people harmed in less visible ways. People with purely psychological harm from witnessing the event, from losing loved ones, first responders, family members, long-term caregivers. If you don't officially count them as victims, you cannot adequately quantify the true extent of the victimization. And crucially, they often fall outside the specific resource allocation streams set up for MVT survivors.
That's a huge gap. And the second problem you mentioned reveals a structural bias regarding which types of events even get classified as MVT incidents worthy of those specialized resources in the first place.
This is where structural racism becomes painfully evident in the data and policy. Events involving ongoing community violence, say, related to gang activity, drug trade conflicts, cycles of retaliation often occurring in marginalized allegations, Black and low-income communities are frequently excluded from MVT research and formal response frameworks. It stems from, frankly, racist stereotypes and assumptions that such violence is somehow expected or endemic or normal in these areas, rather than being recognized as a form of ongoing terrorizing mass violence impacting entire communities. This exclusion denies survivors in those communities the comprehensive systemic support, the specialized mental health funding, the trauma-informed outreach programs, the long-term monitoring that is often made available, rightly so, to survivors of other forms of terrorism or mass violence that fit a narrower, often politically defined profile.
So it's not just that the system struggles to integrate individual trauma within a collective event, but it actively decides, often based on biased criteria, whose trauma is even worthy of systemic recognition and specialized resources. That deepens the systemic injustice for communities already facing marginalization.
Precisely. Systemic support is only truly effective if it acknowledges and actively works to dismantle these inherent structural biases. It needs to recognize that trauma is trauma, regardless of the zip code it occurs in or the type of weapon used. The failure to validate and resource all communities impacted by mass violence simply perpetuates the cycle of psychological harm and inequity. #outro.
Wow. This deep dive, it really forces us to confront just how inadequate our current societal conversation about loss truly is. Healing, whether we're talking at the individual level or the community level, it just isn't about reaching some artificial endpoint or, fulfilling some quota of forgetting.
Oh.
It seems it's really about recognizing the deep, undeniable biological imprint of tragedy and committing to the long, often messy, nonlinear process of integration. It's about weaving the pain, the memory, and the new reality into the evolving narrative of life.
That's exactly it. And the most effective models we've explored today, whether it's the clinical customization you see with NFT and EMDR used together, or that resource-oriented psychodynamic approach for complex trauma, or the long-term proactive systemic outreach needed after disasters, they all honor this nonlinear reality.
They respect the complexity.
They do. They focus on building that regulative capacity first, on customizing support to the individual's needs, and ultimately on giving the individual the agency, the tools to carry their experiences forward without being constantly crushed by them. It's this movement away from that stifling time-bound grief box towards an expansive lifelong process of integration that's the path toward genuine well-being after loss.
And that integration, it changes who you are, doesn't it, at the deepest levels? It results in that duality you spoke of, this capacity for profound sadness, sure, but mixed with an incredible, often unexpected happiness or depth. It gives you perhaps a deeper appreciation of all life has to offer, precisely because you now carry a heart that truly understands how fragile this world we inhabit really is. You see this so perfectly reflected in that final drawing Sonia made after her treatment, the one she simply named. Joy and relief, I feel at ease. Hope, I have hope for life. That state, hope, ease, joy existing alongside the memory of her brother, that profound strength comes from integration, not the emptiness of trying to erase what happened.